The following words are solely for the benefit of those of you who have come in late. If you are already familiar with the three investigators, you may skip this brief commercial and proceed directly to the entertainment portion of the program. Fortunately, this is a book series, so you can accomplish this matter merely by purchasing a volume or two. If this were television, you would have to sit through the whole thing. To fill you in on what has happened over the past 60 years, the Three Investigators is a firm of youthful detectives formed by three enterprising lads, Jupiter Jones, Pete Crenshaw, and Bob Andrews. Jupiter, by his own admission, is the brains of the outfit. Bob takes notes on all cases and does research. Pete, strong and agile, is invaluable as Jupiter's assistant on active missions. The boys live in Rocky Beach, a small city on the shore of the Pacific Ocean, some miles from Hollywood. Here in Southern California, distances are so great that an automobile is a vital necessity. None of the boys is quite old enough to drive, but their car problem was solved when Jupiter won the use of an automobile, complete with chauffeur, in a contest. The car, a gold-plated Rolls-Royce, is theirs for 30 days only, and they are putting it to good use. Headquarters for the Three Investigators is a converted mobile home trailer situated in the Jones salvage yard. The trailer has a small office in it, a lab, a dark room, and equipment which the boys rebuilt from junk that came into the salvage yard. It can be entered by certain secret passages that only youthful individuals can negotiate. You now know all you need to be on your own. I deplore the modern trend towards coddling youth. Therefore, you are now urged to read the book series for yourself to learn the remainder. Alfred Hitchcock.
Greetings, mystery lovers. Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I want to talk about the iconic book series, The Three Investigators. This year marks the series' 60th anniversary as Book 1, The Secret of Terror Castle, was published in 1964. The series is beloved and iconic amongst those of us who grew up with it, but unfortunately, due to Random House here in the US not really seeming to have much interest in the series, the various reprints dropped off very quickly after the 1980s when the series ended, and so outside of one or two sporadic reprints of some of the books, they have become very much out-of-print collectibles here in the US, and they rarely appear on the used book market, so those of us fans basically spend way too much time and far too much money collecting them. But like a number of other American intellectual properties, it's actually a series that is still going strong and wildly popular in other countries, most of all in Germany, where the books had a whole German continuation series that is still ongoing, and I think almost at about 200 original novels. Plus, they've had a long-running iconic German radio drama series, and even feature films have been made. But here in the US, it's still the original book series that is long out of print, and of course beloved by all of us who grew up on these stories. Now, the major draw to the books has always been the usage of Alfred Hitchcock as a name and sort of branding marketing tool for them, as it was known as Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators when it started. This was a rather clever way to utilize Hitchcock's persona, as people thought of him from the iconic parts that he would do for every episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, with his dry wit and the opening and closing bookends for every episode. So essentially what was done with this series is to take the the idea of what Hitchcock did as an announcer, essentially, introducing stories, and apply that to a children's mystery series. So Hitchcock basically writes an introduction to the reader and interacts with the characters at the opening and closing of the case. In each case, he will introduce in book form. And this is established in the first book rather amusingly as the lead characters essentially bluff their way into the studio and essentially make a deal with the world's most famous film director that if they are successful in finding him a haunted house, that he can introduce their cases for a time. But of course, Hitchcock himself did not actually write these introductions, nor did he do the ones for the Presents episodes. But it was a way of using his name and branding that had been done for the Mystery Magazine and all the various story compilation paperbacks and hardcovers that had been published. It was basically another means of promoting the Hitchcock brand in the literary world. But the series was the brainchild of Robert Arthur, who wrote the first 9 books and also book 11. So he wrote 10 books overall. And he was a brilliant writer who came up in, of course, radio and the pulp era and had a vast array of experience, and also worked some on the Presents episodes as a writer. But essentially his desire with the 3 investigators was to create a mystery series for children that was extraordinarily realistic and had characters who were of all different types, but had to rely on their wits and had to use deductive reasoning and have to deal with the fact that they were kids and didn't have resources, such as they didn't have a car to drive around. I think it was a sort of conscious reaction to what the classic Hardy Boys series had become by that point, and the Nancy Drew series as well, in terms of the revised text that had started in 1959, where the characters had seemingly infinite resources and would constantly run around solving mysteries and having action sequences and even globe-trotting and different things. As iconic and great as those stories are, it's not quite as gritty in areas, and it's not quite as realistic in ways that, again, they have seemingly inexhaustible resources, whereas the 3 investigators have to work hard for everything they get. Now, as an adult, that I know the difference between the original text and text revisions of all the Stratemeyer Syndicate books, but especially the Hardy Boys, the 3 investigators harken back much more to the original text Hardy Boys editions of the 1920s and 30s that Leslie McFarlane wrote. That sort of two-fisted, gritty quality and kids essentially solving mysteries because they want to, and it's a struggle to get to the solution, and they have to use deductive reasoning, and they have to be self-reliant, and they have to be extraordinarily smart and be 2 steps ahead of the various criminals. Well, the 3 investigators also adds in a factor that you didn't always see in children's fiction. And that's the fact that every one of the stories had a unique twist. All of the plots, even down to the titles, every single one of them was just a little bit different. Each one felt a little special. It wasn't something that you'd seen or heard of before. And this was aided immeasurably by Robert Arthur and all the other authors who wrote for the series. Even though they were supposed to just be children's books, they never spoke down to the reader. So kids read them and felt like they were in on the adventure because they felt like they were reading exploits of actual kids who were just able to dedicate themselves to mystery solving, so much so that they were actually able to solve crimes and hunt down the villains and different things, and doing it all without any resources other than what they themselves could put together. So the books, even when I was a kid, they felt a bit different, even from the Hardy Boys, and they felt as if they were saying, you know, obviously you don't want to get into physical tangles with villains all the time, but it was also a sort of spirit of you can do this too, and the characters themselves were so well drawn that they felt like real people, and they were not stereotypical average characters without any flaws or physical differences. They were all extraordinarily different from one another, and each sort of represents, I think, a certain personality type. So every kid, regardless of age or aptitude or personality, could sort of recognize elements in the lead three characters and have, certain ones that they gravitated more towards, because each of the lead three characters felt like real kids. So who are the three investigators? They are a junior detective club that they started themselves, consisting of Jupiter Jones, also known as Jupe, Pete Crenshaw, and Bob Andrews. They started the three investigators as a sort of detective club. All of this they did on their own, and it quickly grew from there into being a legitimate enterprise entirely of their own doing, and things really sort of crystallize and take off after the events of the first book, Secret of Terror Castle, where they successfully solve a decades-old mystery involving a spooky old mansion of a long-dead silent film star, and get the connection to Alfred Hitchcock, who agrees to introduce and promote each of their new cases. Sometimes Hitchcock himself in the books actually introduces or gives a case or lead to the boys. But they, of course, operate out of where Jupiter lives with his aunt and uncle at the Jones Salvage Yard. And this gives the boys endless amounts of junk and materials to cobble together into all kinds of crime-fighting equipment. So they're able to develop everything from a working telephone to their own dark room to their own printer to print their own business cards that they laminate themselves. So again, there's such a DIY aesthetic to all of the stories that just endears them further to the reader and gives them a timeless quality. But also they have their secret base, the iconic headquarters, which again is built entirely out of a DIY aesthetic, as Jupiter, Bob, and Pete took essentially an old RV trailer and fixed it up and covered it in all kinds of bits of junk so that everyone forgets that it was ever there in the first place. And they devise a number of secret entrances and exits to headquarters, which become absolutely iconic to all kids who read them. So all the iconic ones like Tunnel 2, but also the secret entrances and exits to the salvage yard, such as Green Gate 1 and Red Gate Rover, all beautifully described to the degree that the reader can visualize them even decades later as an adult. So it's all due to the boys' creativity and dedication to this sort of occupation they've given themselves. And all the adults around them simply think, oh, well, that's nice. They have something to do, and boys will be boys. But the influence of Jupiter Jones cannot be overstated, because he is essentially a young genius of ridiculous intellectual capabilities, but also someone who is very much determined to always apply deductive reasoning, and he essentially rubs off on Pete and Bob. But what's great about the three characters is that each one has abilities that the other doesn't have, and so they essentially plug in and fill the gaps. Pete Crenshaw is the most athletic of the three, and thus the one who usually gets into the most danger and adventure assignments. Jupiter, or Jupe as we all love to call him, is of course the brains of the operation, but also an extraordinarily gifted mimic and impressionist, and that comes in handy in practically every one of the books. But he also devises the various methods the boys use, such as the iconic ghost-to-ghost hookup, which is essentially an early form of mass communication using the phone lines. And then Bob Andrews is usually the research expert and also has a part-time job at the library, so he can always use that time to do further book research. And again, each of the characters is not a traditional, what would be termed a perfect average boy character. Even when you look at their sort of physical descriptions, again, Pete Crenshaw is the most athletic. But Jupiter Jones is obviously a bit on the heavier side, and that's a particular element that the character does have to deal with, and always being teased or, of course, also being underestimated for his intellect, essentially because he's still at a young age, so everyone takes him for granted, and that's an eternal frustration that he has to try and turn to his own advantage, usually to try to get one over on various criminals or suspects. Bob Andrews is also a character who has to deal with a particular handicap, which is not something that you saw in children's books of the 1960s, having a lead character who had a leg in a brace for most of the early books. He had had a bad injury, and so the books always describe how he couldn't really, like, especially if the boys were having to run, that was always a particular element that always crept up. And that's something that would happen to a real person and be a particular hurdle for them to not only have to live with, but to overcome, especially when the action starts to get thick and heavy. It's something that all three have to worry about when one of them has a particular physical handicap and can't physically do all the things that the other two can do. But again, every single one of these elements give further dimension to each of the characters, and each one feels like a real kid that you wish you knew, because you wish you could have joined the three investigators as a kid. But they develop all kinds of working methodologies, and of course have their own laminated business cards with the iconic 3 question marks, which is part of Jupiter's wonderful means of self-advertising, of getting people curious about what do the question marks mean. But also that ties into the personal identifiers, as each of the members always carries a particular color of chalk. So if they're ever having to leave messages for the others, or heaven forbid they're kidnapped and having to be traced, they can actually leave their color-coded chalk question marks. And to the untrained eye, it looks like something any kid might have done. And then, of course, the business cards also include the classic trademark slogan, "We investigate anything." And that's a key line because, again, each and every one of the plots is a really intricate conceit for the actual central plot theme and the MacGuffin of the story, if you will. Every single one of them is something a bit different. I think Robert Arthur set a precedent of trying to make sure that every book was at least a little bit special. It was never going to be a easy, simple mystery. If there's a straightforward crime, it's not going to be as straightforward by the climax, or it's going to be a simple crime that actually ties into a much more convoluted mystery with a very wild sort of theme, whether it's searching through the haunted mansion of a dead silent film star, or if it's searching for the parrots of a dead man, including one who stutters, or if it's aiding an Egyptologist who, while examining his mummy, for whatever reason, it seems to whisper, but only to him. And he's on the brink of wondering if he is truly insane. And that's just a brief little description of the basic plot idea of the first 3 books. The books continued on with each one having a unique particular spin on whatever mystery was being told. So again, each of the books, even the books by other authors, always retain this sense of trying to be a cut above everything else in terms of characterization, detail of the world. The boys live in Rocky Beach, California, which is located somewhere in Southern California within relative distance of Los Angeles. All the plots themselves had to have unique elements to make them feel fresh and exciting. But the greatest conceit overall, the thing that ties all of this together and I think makes the series timeless, is not the usage of Hitchcock as a brand, but the degree of realism in the stories. And again, this goes for all of the books. The realism of the stories, the realism of the setting, the realism of the lead 3 characters, all of it flows in to the entire book. So the books feel lived in. And all of this makes them even more remarkable reading as an adult, because you realize how far ahead of their time these were, and in a lot of areas, they're still unmatched. So it's an absolute shame they have not remained in print for further generations to read. And hopefully that changes now that we have seen the first modern reprints this year for the 60th anniversary, which I'll get to in a minute. But it is a beloved series for a great number of reasons that I've highlighted. But they remain, I think, short of the Hardy Boys, simply due to iconic status and overall longevity. I think The Three Investigators is the one series that rivals the Hardy Boys in terms of greatest overall children's mystery series. Plus, you have the Hitchcock connection, wonderful cover artwork designs over the years, and enough books in the series to where it became something cherished that you waited until you could get the next book. Or if you grew up like me long after the series had ended, you were just excited to find any new book in a library or in a used bookshop, and that got increasingly difficult. So it is unfortunately very difficult to piece together an entire collection of all of the books, plus the additional series, but it is well worth your time, as The Three Investigators is, without question, one of the greatest series in all of children's literature, one of the great mystery series, period, regardless of it being ostensibly designed to be read by children. And what helps with that is the fact that the boys themselves are not necessarily kids. They're not, I guess you would say they are young teenagers, because it seems to be they're around 12 to 14 years old, as they're not old enough to have a driver's license. And that's another example of the boys' ingenuity. The way they're able to get around in the early books is that Jupiter Jones was able to win a contest put out by a rental car agency, which gave the winner a limited usage for a certain period of time of a beautiful gold-plated Rolls Royce that comes complete with its own wonderful chauffeur named Worthington, who becomes a trusted confidant of the boys, rather amusingly. But that's how they get around for longer distance travels, because they can only go so far on their bicycles, and of course have to be back before dinner or curfew and things. So they have to worry about what actual kids would worry about. But that's how they get around for longer distances, over distances over a couple miles, and then they have to figure out ways of how can they possibly keep this going. And once the rental car expires, how do they get transportation again? This is stuff that the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and other iconic series never really have to worry about. So that's a key example, I think, of how the boys have to always rely on their ingenuity. They don't have money. They're not rich. They're kids, and they have their little bits of money they can save up from mowing lawns or having a part-time job at the library, and every bit of equipment they have is basically cobbled together. And of course it helps when you have Jupiter Jones, who's a wizard due to his incredible intellect, and can even rig up portable homemade walkie-talkies or tracking devices out of bits of spare junk in the 1960s. So there's also a nice element of kids getting into learning bits of not just technology, but engineering, and also, again, the theme of having to use what is available, what resources you have, and kids having to use their ingenuity. And what's a better place for that than the Jones salvage yard, where seemingly every bit of junk in the world will turn up and provide the boys with an incredible amount to use for their crusade against crime. Now, in terms of the books themselves, again, we started with Secret of Terror Castle in 1964, and then Robert Arthur would continue and write the first 9 books plus book 11. So he wrote 10 books overall, and then other authors continued continued the series, which ran up until about 1987, and that meant we saw 43 books in the original series before it ended. And then we saw 4 books that Random House tried to compete with the Choose Your Own Adventure craze, and so they had their own iteration of that called the Find Your Fate mysteries. So the 3 investigators had 4 in that series, which is unfortunately also very difficult to collect. But then there was also an attempt to revamp the series for older, more mature readers. And that was done to compete against what was being done with the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, particularly with the Hardy Boys case files, which were suddenly a much edgier, darker attempt to try and bring the spirit of a really pulpy, gritty men's adventure paperback into the world of the Hardy Boys. So with the 3 investigators, they actually did the Crime Busters series, which ran for 11 books here in the US, and a same sort of designed paperback in terms of size and dimensions. So this looks very much like one of the Hardy Boys case files or one of the Nancy Drew files. But this was really the sort of last attempt that was done for the 3 investigators in terms of having new books come out here in the US. So again, there are 43 books in the original series, 4 in the Find Your Fates, and then 11 in the Crime Busters series. And then after that, there were a couple sporadic attempts, really just in the early 90s and then the late 90s, for some of the books to get paperback reprints, and then they've been completely out of print ever since. Now, the other factor to look at is the actual Hitchcock branding. Hitchcock himself, of course, passed away in 1980, so that meant Book 30, The Secret of Shark Reef, which was released in 1979, was the last to have the Hitchcock introduction and closing and any mention of Hitchcock's name. The next book was released in 1981, and that was changed to not have any mention of Hitchcock, and so they came up with a then fictional character of Hector Sebastian, who basically fulfilled the same role and was a then popular mystery writer. That was the idea, that basically the boys were now being introduced and championed by a world-famous mystery writer. So it fulfills the same purpose, does the same thing, but that meant the first 30 books, seemingly due to either licensing reasons or the Hitchcock estate not really wanting to continue, the first 30 books had to be tweaked slightly, and this is where the notion of Hitchcock text comes into play. So after 1980, when they would continue to do reprints of the first 30 books and the then current paperback series, they quietly started redoing the openings and closings to remove Hitchcock and substitute the Hector Sebastian character. For the first book, they came up with a fictional director called Reginald Clark, because Hitchcock actually appears in the text of the book in addition to doing the introduction and closing. So they had to basically make up a fictional director who didn't exist to replace that. The actual texts themselves remained exactly the same. It's just the names were changed and a couple little words here and there to make them fit. But when you compare them directly, you can tell that they were being very careful to not alter the text in any other way, and they were just simply having to do this out of necessity. So if you ever see reference to books either being a Hitchcock text or not, that's what it's referring to, that for the first 30 books, a Hitchcock text in a various older edition will have mention of Hitchcock on the cover and have Hitchcock in the opening and closing in terms of actually being the one who gives the introduction. Now, in terms of the overall US editions, each one had a really unique particular style, and most featured truly iconic artwork, which again makes the collectability factor much greater, and the fact that the editions themselves are much more scarce than the other major children's mystery series. There is quite a price premium for virtually any type of Three Investigators volume, and they rarely pop up, so even in lesser condition they can cost quite a bit. But the original editions are the most sought after, as they are the wonderful hardcover editions with the beautiful artwork printed on, as I have 2 examples here of book 1 and 4, but they are very difficult to get in good condition, and also the bindings on the earlier books can be quite susceptible to splitting, so you do have to sometimes do spine repair on them. And then the later books usually only turned up in hardcover more as special library editions. So those are incredibly rare, and usually the price numbers as you go along trying to get all of the hardcover volumes, it usually goes up exponentially as you go through the series. Then throughout the 1970s, there were paperback editions, mostly done by Scholastic. They started by having the artwork of the original hardcover editions, but then transitioned into having their own versions, and then also having unique artwork for the really slimmed down paperbacks, as Scholastic made some for the Weekly Reader series. Now, the original editions all featured really beautiful and frankly iconic interior illustrations as well, mostly by Harry Kane, all done in really lovely black and white, but those, of course, would not last throughout all editions. So if you can manage to get all of the early books that had interior illustrations with the interior illustrations in various editions, that's a real challenge. Due to the series' longevity, the way you're able to build a mostly complete set with most of the books is getting to the different sized paperbacks of the late 70s, which then transitioned into the classic paperbacks of the 1980s. This started with the wonderful Marchese cover paperbacks from 1978 or so, which all feature really beautiful, striking artwork depicting elements of the book, but also with frankly, a surrealistic edge. These are iconic in their own right, and most of them do also retain the original internal illustrations as well. This sort of size and design transitioned into what we saw for the paperbacks of the 1980s. So these Marchese books are really unique and very collectible, but they only did certain books, not all of them. And they're called Marchese in reference to the actual cover artist. The paperbacks of the 80s started in what is known as the Hitchcock cover design, all with covers by the incredible artist Robert Andragna, who wound up doing basically both new for the current books and then artworks for the pre-existing books to make a nice uniform paperback series in the same dimensions as the Marchese series. But these were all beautifully done. But when you refer to the Hitchcock cover, it is using the Hitchcock profile as the little logo in the upper corner of the book cover and also on the spine. And this means that you've essentially got the original book with the Alfred Hitchcock introductions. These would last for a number of years, but would be quietly transitioned into the tweaked, revised versions that removed any usage of the Hitchcock name and replaced him with Hector Sebastian. This had the same design aesthetic and the same artist for the covers, so they match perfectly, but these are known as the keyhole covers, and that is because the Hitchcock profile is now replaced with a keyhole. For example, here are two copies of Book 1. Here, of course, as you can see, we have the Hitchcock profile, and then here is a later keyhole printing where that's now literally a keyhole. The actual printing and art and everything is the same. We have the same design, although you can see, depending on age and wear, there is a little bit of color difference, but that actually seems to be part of the original printing. But otherwise, they are relatively the same. The only difference here is the introduction has a different, now fictional character, and then when Hitchcock is actually in the text of Book 1, it is now instead this same fictional character. That is the style the books finished the run of the original 43N. Then there was a gap where all that was in print was the then current Crime Busters series, which then came and went rather quickly after Book 11, and then we saw a short-lived reprint from the Bullseye imprint with new cover artworks that are they're kind of hit or miss, but at least they represent the books. But unfortunately, only some of the books were reprinted at this point, and they, of course, were the non-Hitchcock text and didn't have internal illustrations. Then in 1998, the first few books had what is technically, until this year, their last reprinting in what is known as the Dodge series, because the cover artist was Bill Dodge. This is at least a solid way to read the first couple books, but again, they have no internal illustrations and they are the non-Hitchcock text. The art is okay, but it does make the boys seem quite a bit younger and seems to have more of a children's book feel as compared to the classic iconic earlier covers. But they at least had a uniform spine design. It was, again, unfortunate though that it was just a few of the books being reprinted, and then they went back out of print again and remained out of print. So 1998 was the last time any of the Three Investigators books were in print in any form. So here in 2024, we're now celebrating the 60th anniversary of the series, and now the daughter of Robert Arthur, Elizabeth Arthur, has not only announced a new continuation series that she and her husband are working on to release as print on demand and ebooks, but also they've brought back into print all 10 of the Robert Arthur Three Investigators novels, which again are available as ebooks and print on demand. They do have a nice uniform cover design. They're not as eye-catching or iconic as any of the originals, but at least a solid attempt was made to make a nice new unique cover design that matched all the books. But at least it's getting the books back available again. They are currently available wherever you like to order books online, and I'll leave some links in the description below. Again, it's only the books written by Robert Arthur, as I don't think they have the rights to the others at present, but also they are, of course, the non-Hitchcock text, because that is a particular licensing issue, and I don't know exactly how or who would be the one to work that out. But at the very least, a version of the 10 books written by the series creator are now available again, bringing the books back into print for the first time in 26 years. So that is a great achievement in and of itself. Plus, we're going to be seeing a quite a substantial attempt at a continuation series by Elizabeth Arthur coming out within the next year. So that's comforting to at least finally have something new in terms of the iconic Three Investigators in its native country, which, outside of fan groups and websites and finding the occasional book in the wild and being super excited because they never pop up in the wild, there's been nothing else. And contrast that with the amazing success of the series in other countries, but especially in Germany, where they are continuing to publish new novel after new novel. And unfortunately, only a handful have been translated into English. They've even done German versions of manuscripts for the original series and for Crime Busters that were never actually published. So those are actually available in German form. If you can read German, you'll have a blast reading the German novels and also listening to the German radio series and seeing the German language films. So it's another iconic American piece of media that after a certain point fell into obscurity in its native country, but retained a diehard following and amount of new materials in other countries. So unfortunately, if you're a fan and you're interested in the German works, you really do have to either have a working knowledge of German or try to hope that eventually we can see more of the German works get a English translation. But this is basically just preaching to the choir in terms of all fans in Germany of Die Drei, which is what the Three Investigators are known as in the German iteration. So that's just a basic overview and some of my thoughts on the iconic Three Investigators series, which astoundingly is 60 years old this year. That just thinking that is, as Pete Crenshaw or any of the boys would say, is definitely a skull buster. If you ever read any of the books, there's so many elements and even just quotes and lines and things that just get burned in your brain, and that is certainly one of them. But it remains one of the most timeless children's book series of all time. There's a reason why anytime you mention the Three Investigators, if someone read them when they grew up, even if they haven't thought of them since they were 10 years old, immediately you see that light come on in their eyes and they perk up and they instantly have a flood of fond memories come through. It's the same sort of thing when you talk to people about the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew, but with the Three Investigators, it's a little bit more special because the series never had the same sort of mass audience in terms of overall numbers and sheer longevity, because the Hardy Boys started in 1927, but also because of those elements I mentioned before of all of the mysteries having unique elements and unique spins and spooky atmosphere. But at the end of things, we're all about deductive reasoning and about kids not only being themselves, but also using their wits and using everything that they had at their disposal and overcoming odds in both personal life and life as amateur detectives to try and be taken seriously and try to solve crimes and mysteries. And the journey of reading one of the books wasn't just getting the solution of the mystery, but seeing how the three investigators actually did it with their limited resources and being entirely on their own and kind of doing all this without any of their parents realizing exactly what they were doing and how they were operating as essentially as close as they could be to actual detectives with limited resources, just being kids who didn't have any money and only had bicycles and had to figure out how to do all this stuff and even build their own equipment inside of the iconic and magical headquarters that every kid who ever read a Three Investigators book wished they had access to. If there was a theme park that had a recreation of headquarters, every person who ever read a Three Investigators book would stand in line for a week and not care. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a Three Investigators theme park somewhere in Germany, but if that was the case, I certainly would go. But it remains one of my most cherished reading memories. I still adore the series. I still collect the series. I do not have a complete collection, but I do have most of the books, and thankfully most of the first 30 I do have in the Hitchcock text form in some printing or another. I hope to someday complete the series, but I am going to start a reread for the 60th anniversary, so hopefully that means I will have a video up relatively soon on The Secret of Terror Castle, which itself is not only a great start to the series and one of the best books in the series, but that book, along with my other most read books in the series, is among my favorite books of all time. It is still timeless and a blast to read in 2024, 60 years later. And for us classic film geeks, having the Hitchcock connection just makes it all the more irresistible. So if you've never read any of the Three Investigators, now is the perfect time for the 60th anniversary. You don't have to read them in chronological order, but it does help to read all the initial books first and read the Robert Arthur books first, as he was the series creator and set the tone and wrote basically the first 10 books, again with just one interruption. So he wrote books 1 through 9 and then book 11. But all the books are very well written and done to the same sort of standard. It's just the later books in the series that are increasingly difficult to get as you go along in number, and the last couple books around 40 to 43 are exceptionally rare and quite expensive, and you basically have to get into eBay bidding wars trying to get a solid copy. So I hope to complete my collection, but I will be doing a video review series of each of the books for the 60th anniversary, and that's why I wanted to finally sit down and talk about one of my favorite book experiences of all time and one of the most cherished memories I have from my childhood. For those of us who read the books as a kid, I think we all feel that way, and even if you haven't read them since that time, there's no better time than the 60th anniversary to revisit the world of the Three Investigators, return to Rocky Beach, California, and visit the Jones salvage yard to perhaps make a dash into headquarters. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic children's books and book collecting and book series, and of course the world of the Three Investigators, has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, this is a video I've wanted to make for quite some time, and with it being the 60th anniversary this year, it felt like the perfect time, and I can't wait to start my series reread. And also, I'm hoping to finally get the last couple books that I need to at least have all of the 43 books in the original series. But again, it is quite difficult even today to try and find a solid reading copy of all the books. So that makes it tricky, but at least it is possible to get a good amount of the books. And now we do have actual in-print versions of all 10 Robert Arthur books. So that would be the best place to start, which you can again get in print-on-demand paperback or in ebook format, whatever retailer you prefer. And I'll have links to all of those in the description. So as always, please keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some Three Investigators editions, even though I know that's easier said than done. It happens every once in a while, and there's few thrills in terms of hunting for used books like finding a minty, affordable Three Investigators edition that you were missing. So definitely keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching. And remember, we investigate anything. Green Gate 1, the presses are rolling.
There may be a few details of the Three Investigators which you would like cleared up. I shall undertake to tie up any loose ends, as Pete, Bob, and Jupiter are busy. Upon reviewing everything that has happened since I met Jupiter Jones and his friends, I am forced to conclude that perhaps I was a trifle too harsh in my judgment of them. Jupiter Jones is still somewhat headstrong and overly self-confident, but I have faith that his intelligence and judgment will enable him to overcome these faults. Indeed, I am strongly thinking of sending the Three Investigators on another case. Any interesting developments will be promptly reported to you. Alfred Hitchcock. In spite of his words, he couldn't help wondering what adventure the Three Investigators would find themselves in next. Whatever it was, it would be something unusual. Of that, he had no doubt.